This is a relatively short trip for me to the States. I love Washington, D.C. I always love coming here and have very fond memories. This is the first American city I spent a serious amount of time in after we had children, which you could actually walk around when you were down in the center. And I always thought how nice it would be to come and, if I ever moved to the States, live in Washington, D.C. And then I realized that if you actually did move to America, that you can't actually afford to live in Washington, D.C. You have to live somewhere else. And therefore, all those pavements, you don't get to walk around anyway. But it is a joy to be here. Now, because I would like to try to make sure you have time to ask me some questions, I'd like to frame my remarks to you around a series of questions that I would like to put to you. And so I know it may seem slightly unfair if you've come here expecting me to give you a series of answers, and you may leave with more questions than when you came. But as far as I can tell, this is a free event, so really you shouldn't be complaining anyway. Enjoy your lunch. Now, the framework I'm going to use, I'm going to borrow from a guy called Aristotle. You won't have heard about him recently. He died a while ago. But in his book, The Rhetoric, he took three main sections, and I'm going to just use that as a framework. I'm going to use it differently to the way that he used it to try to pose these series of questions to you. But in The Rhetoric, he talked about ethos, pathos, and logos, or if we were to sort of anglicize the pronunciation there, ethos, pathos, logos. Ethos, a question of ethics; pathos, passion, what is it that informs; and then logos, what is the framework of meaning, logic, word that actually interprets and makes sense of the situation that we find ourselves in. So let me just start first of all with ethos. Now, what is interesting with Aristotle is that when he wrote the book The Rhetoric, his primary concern wasn't so much about saying what is the ethic that should be espoused and given to other people. His primary concern was when you're ever listening to somebody speak, and when anyone is offering you any form of solution, the primary question you should be asking is not what is the ethic that they espouse, but rather what is the ethic they live by. In other words, can you trust the person who's up front? I have the great privilege of working with a guy called Ravi Zacharias, and some of you I'm sure will be familiar with him. He's written several books. He's an okay speaker. And I can remember many years ago hearing this story. A lady had brought a friend of hers to come and hear Ravi Zacharias speak. She was quite a strong atheist and had come with a lot of questions. And she listened to him speak, and then she listened to him handle questions for just under an hour. And as they were walking out the auditorium, this lady said to her friend, "Well, what did you make of that?" And she said, "Impressive. Deeply impressive. I wonder what his life looks like." And that is, if you like, very much what Aristotle was getting to. How do we have a framework which allows us to understand what is not just simply what other people say that we should be doing, but what is the ethics of the leaders and the rhetoricians that we have in our society, and how do we know that we can trust in them? And what is happening right now in terms of our economic system is a systematic collapse of trust. We're not sure who to believe, we're not sure who we can trust, and we're not sure where to go anymore. Now, it is maybe with some degree of irony that all of our top business schools have been teaching that all ethics is a matter of relativity, that when we finally had a banking system that treated all ethics as a matter of relativity, people felt that they didn't like what they actually got. And now what we have is revolt. But what is interesting, with all of the protesting which is going on and all of the demonstrations, people aren't exactly sure what they're protesting against. It's just that they feel unhappy, but we're not quite sure why we feel unhappy. But what is simmering underneath all of that is a deep sense of distrust. Now, what's interesting is when you raise these kinds of questions, you very often get very unexpected answers. So there are all kinds of situations where you walk in, where you look at something, you think this doesn't look right, you ask a question, and the answer that you get when you ask that difficult question is not what you were expecting. I mean, the story is told of a reporter who recently went to Afghanistan, and they wanted to see what had happened, sort of post-Taliban. And they were shocked to see that women were still following their husbands 10 paces behind them, which was actually required within the culture while the Taliban were in charge, out of respect. The husband is the leader, the wife, because she is subservient to him, she walks a respectable at least 10 yards behind the husband. And this is still going on. And so one of the reporters stopped one of the ladies and said, "What on earth are you doing? The Taliban are being thrown out of Afghanistan. Why do you still walk 10 paces behind your husband?" And this lady looked at the reporter and said, "Well, there are a lot of landmines." And so the questions that we ask sometimes can give very surprising answers. They don't actually deliver the answer that we expect. And nowhere is this more true when it becomes the interplay, certainly between ethics and business. Now, I can remember many years ago as I would fly around the world, people would say to me, so, what do you do? And I would explain, I work with this Christian organization, and I also teach a little bit at the University of Oxford. And then, well, what do you teach? Well, I teach business ethics. People would often laugh. Ha! That's an oxymoron. And then Enron collapsed. I don't know if you can remember that. But all of a sudden, at that point, it didn't seem so funny anymore. As a matter of fact, if you're able to cast your mind back far enough to September the 11th, which I'm sure is a date that none of you will forget, in light of that terrible tragedy, you may have noticed that as those towers came down, the stock markets around the world also collapsed. Now, what's also forgotten is that by early 2002, they had by and large recovered. Then, as we moved into the rest of 2002, we had Enron, WorldCom, and all of that, and the market fell further and faster than it did than after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, telling you that what the market feared most was not a terrorist attack from without, but a moral collapse from within. In other words, if you don't know who you can trust, you have a huge problem. You have a problem with investment. You have a problem in terms of with the product. You have a problem in terms of how you predict how your business will go, because the whole system works on a basis of trust. And when trust collapses and when trust disappears, you now find that you cannot simply operate. I don't know if any of you have seen the TV program Lie to Me. Have any of you seen that? It's a brilliant piece of programming, I have to say, a remarkably intelligent piece of programming, and the main character is a Brit, and that's nice. And it's actually based off the real-life work of a guy who's actually now made millions, Dr. Paul Ekman, who did his study in what's now very well-known field of these sort of what are called micro-expressions. But if you watch those programs carefully, you may not be aware of this. He has written a sort of a psychological commentary that runs alongside the TV series that he produced. And at one point, he talks about how trust and the function of trust is essential to all forms of relationship, including business relationship. And then he starts to speculate on what on earth happens when you have a systematic breakdown of trust within a society. And the answer is, and he's now writing, I think, as far as I'm aware, of no form of religious conviction whatsoever, that it is utterly disastrous, both to the nature of the market and indeed even to the individual. Because you cannot even form personal relationships in the absence of trust. Just think about it. Your friends are people who you feel can trust. And trust is a function of truth and ethics. You trust those who you believe tell you the truth, and you trust those who you believe are trustworthy. And when you have a collapse in either of those two fields, all of a sudden you find that you cannot trust anyone. And there's a huge difference if you're in business and you're surrounded by people with whom you feel who you fundamentally mistrust, and if you're in business with those who you're sure you fundamentally can trust. Your emotional enjoyment and satisfaction that will come from working in those two fields will be remarkably different depending on which context you're actually placed within. So these questions, suffice to say, are not simple questions of abstraction. They become very, very, very important. So here is my question. Who do you trust? Who do you know you can trust? Are you trustworthy? Nobody would put their money in a bank if they felt that the bank couldn't be trusted, and we've had some very dramatic experience of that. Now, sometimes people say, especially in the business world, but wait a minute, Michael, we have to be realistic here. This is a pretty cutthroat business. I can guarantee you there isn't a single organization that doesn't insist on trustworthiness. Let's do a brief case study with the mafia. Now, I don't know if any of you work for the mafia. I'm sure you wouldn't make yourselves known if you did. If you think that moral questions of trustworthiness are not important to the mafia, you try double-crossing them and see what happens. It's not a question of whether moral standards apply. The question is how far we're prepared to apply them. Now, in the context of that, what is normally happening is we're saying, this is absolutely important. We will insist on loyalty, complete integrity, and if you steal from us or you embezzle us, we're not going to report you to the authorities. Okay, we'll just come and take you out, your family, your family's family, and all of your friends. There is a strongly enforced ethical system, but that ethic responsibility and reciprocity is limited by a circle. So it's not a question of whether we think ethics apply, the question is how far it applies. And so even if you're working in a business where you have questions, where you have ethical questions or ethical considerations, it's not the fact that the company itself can be systematically unethical. That's simply not possible. They have to demand on your loyalty, your integrity, and everything else in order to maintain within the circle. The problem is they do not recognize the fact it should be extended to anyone outside of the circle. Are you trustworthy? Who do you trust? And what is the basis that is forming those opinions? You have to be able to answer those questions. If you can't, we find out that we're in trouble. Pathos, passion. What is it that guides and gets us out of bed every morning to do the things that we should actually do? Now, in a materialistic society, the answer is money. Well, I need money. And it becomes very pragmatical, and it's very interesting. As soon as we answer that second question in that way, we often then lose sight of the ethos. But we have to understand how, if you like, certainly wealth, certainly within the Western system, has come about. Because again, it's one of those surprising answers to what appears to be a deceptively simple question. But if you were to look at the classical economists, like people like Adam Smith and so on, what they would all say is, look, in order to build up wealth at an individual and at a national level, you need to have prudence. Prudence is a moral value that is a mixture of reason and commitment. Okay, without prudence, you cannot build up wealth. But the trouble is that as prudence builds up wealth, wealth gives rise to temptation, temptation can give rise to indulgence, and indulgence eats up wealth. So when you have an affluent society, which is at that point so concerned with the idea of consumption as opposed to the idea of production, you suddenly find both that a type of laziness begins to come in, the culture itself begins to die unless it's revitalized, and you begin to lose sight of the prudence, the forms of commitment that actually made that wealth possible in the first place. Now, the challenge, therefore, is that in any affluent economy, and there's no way about it, we are actually sitting in what was up until very recently considered to be the world's most affluent economy, and by many measures still is, although we're now in this enormous crisis moment, is that when you are in an affluence, what happens is scarcity becomes scarce. In other words, before there is affluence, before there is an abundance, most people's lives are channeled and controlled by scarce resources. You can't afford the new house and the new car and the new clothes and the family holiday and the private education and all at the same time. So scarcity begins to form a dam which blocks you in and drives you in a particular direction, and you operate within those limits. Now, prudence, the idea of a mixture of moral will and reason and commitment, which channels you, if prudence is not built up during a time of affluence, as the affluence comes, scarcity becomes scarce. Those natural physical things that limit you at that point taken away. You can now indulge yourself in anything you want to. And very quickly it becomes meaningless, we realize psychologically. We are swamped by an excess of reward and we simply cannot handle it. And a very few people at the very top may lose it altogether. Now, one of the most penetrating books that was written by this, in my opinion, was by Professor Avner Offer, the Ticelli Professor of Economic History at the University of Oxford, in his book, The Challenge of Affluence, which I would recommend. It's not a Christian book or any religious book of any description, but it's certainly very insightful. If the prudence has not been built up, then in times of affluence, we lose the plot altogether. There is nothing to control and channel whatever passions that we do have. We lose focus, and again, we're destroyed. The difficulty then comes with the challenge that flows as indulgence begins to eat up affluence, and we suddenly find ourselves in debit rather than in credit. That again, without that moral framework, the ethos that is around us, if that hasn't been put in place, we simply lose direction and all hope disappears with it too. Because now we're just dealing with too many questions simultaneously to be able to make sense of them in any meaningful way. Pathos. What is it that guides your passion? And what is the source of your passion and joy in the first place? Well, let me ask you another question. Why do you work? Why do you come to work in the first place? Now, this is a largely Christian audience, so let me just talk to the Christians first. Why do you work? Now, what most of you will say is, well, Michael, I've got a wife, I've got 18 children, I have a mortgage. That's why I work. Now, if that's our response to that question, we have a problem. As a matter of fact, if you're a Christian, you have a king-size problem. Because Jesus told us specifically that is the reason not to work. Now, if you're sitting here and you're tracking what I'm saying at this point, you're going to say, wait a minute, Michael, this is problematic for me. Does the Bible not say if a man does not work, he shall not eat? Well, actually, no. The Bible says if a man will not work, he shall not eat. And that's not the same. And you're about to find what it is, and we are beginning to find what it is to work in an economy where there is a desire to work and you just simply can't find it. Those are two different things. Now, Jesus' teaching on this subject actually came in a context where he was actually talking about money, where he very famously says, and this is when I hope the battery hasn't died in my Bible. Isn't that a terrible thing? Don't worry, I'm in AOL. Wasn't able to get online, though. So, let's just provide a in-house challenge here. This is Jesus speaking. No one can serve two masters, for either he'll hate one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Now, let's just start off by making something very clear about these things. I'm going to read a bit more of this in a minute. Jesus is not saying that you cannot make money. That's not what he's saying. He's saying you cannot serve money. The question is, who do you serve? Then he goes on to say some very famous words. Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you'll put on. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not more valuable than they? And which of you, being anxious, can add a single hour or span to his life? And why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all of his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? Now listen carefully to what Jesus says next. For the Gentiles seek after all of these things. Isn't that interesting? Jesus says, those who do not follow me, this is the reason why they work. So the question then comes, well, why do we work? And your heavenly Father knows that you need them. So it's not a question that we don't need these things. We need them. These things are needed. And now comes this very famous saying, which is often quoted, but never in context. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added to you. What's he saying here? Jesus is saying is that the byproduct of work is food, clothing, housing, and everything else. Those are the byproducts of work, but they are not the primary reason for work. He's speaking to motivation, and he's speaking to whom we first and foremost serve. And whom we first and foremost serve, should be as Christians, is God. We seek his righteousness and his kingdom. Now, these words are used multivalently. They mean, first and foremost, his rule. It means that, first and foremost, if you are a Christian, the first thing that you seek is what is God's will and his righteousness, the manner in which you should do it, and then you pursue it. And in pursuing it, the byproduct of all of this is food, clothing, wealth, and so on, and it is an incredible thing. Now, why is this so important? If you forget what the goal is, you will go for the byproduct as opposed to the goal, and as soon as you begin to do that, the temptation is to ethically cut the corners in order to get those byproducts, rather than have the goal in mind. And this then becomes dramatically, very pragmatic in terms of how it's going to govern your life if you are a Christian. Because it means that we have to understand that whatever you are doing, whatever you are called to do, wherever you are serving, whether you are the CEO or whether you sweep the floor, that God has a purpose and a call for you. And whatever manner and whatever you do it in a manner as if you are serving him. Now, I realize that this is very challenging, and there are a million of practical questions that say, well, how does this actually practically work out at? Now, interestingly, if you take, let's say, Peter, one of the Christians, Jesus' first disciples, there was a time quite early on where Jesus was standing on the shore, and Peter and his fishermen friends, their little boat came in. And Jesus said to them, hey, did you catch any fish? And Peter says, no. And Jesus says, well, let down your nets. And Peter says, well, Jesus, we, the experts, have been out all night, which is when you go fishing, the fish don't see you coming at night time. Okay, in the deep waters, that's where the fish live, so it's helpful to go fishing there because that's where the fish are. And we haven't caught anything. Okay, and now here we are, we're in the daylight, and you're a carpenter, and this is obviously the shallow water. And now these boys, they're recent Christian converts, so they're very polite about how they say this. And Jesus says, let down your nets. Now, Peter's response is fascinating. Peter lets down his nets. In the first time in his life, he goes fishing not to catch fish. Now, he's already told us he doesn't think there are any fish, so we know that he doesn't believe there are any to be caught. However, he says, at your word, I will let down my nets. And Peter goes fishing for no other reason than the God of the universe has asked him to. And the nets go down, and the fish come up, and the boat begins to sink. Do you remember Peter's first response? Depart from me, I am a sinful man. And when Peter goes to work for no other reason than he is being told to, and he's doing it now for him as opposed to, and for God as opposed to for himself, not only does he find an abundance, but he also is convicted of his sin. It's very interesting in the whole financial crisis, how we're all looking for people to blame. I mean, the most amazing thing about the financial crisis is that bankers have actually made themselves more unpopular than politicians. I never thought that was possible. Now, the reason is that everyone's looking for someone to blame. Simple truth is that most of us are in this for one thing and one thing only, money. Most of us are motivated by greed. All of us want more, and we're no different to anyone else. And so if we really want to discover and answer the question, who gets the credit for this crunch, we simply have to stand long enough in the mirror and recognize where our own hearts and minds actually play a central role in all of this. What is the reason? What is the passion that drives and informs us and takes us out to work? Now, lastly, logos. What is the word that brings a framework of meaning to all of this? Now, what's very interesting is when we often talk about someone bringing a word into a situation, we're asking for them to bring a framework of interpretation to help us understand where we are. Within the Christian faith, the idea of the word is far more extensive than that. It's not a word of instruction, it's a word of transformation. When I was speaking in Pakistan a couple of years ago, and I was speaking to a room filled with people from the military and from the different various professional worlds. And interestingly, there were 8 psychiatrists in this particular audience. And my understanding is that there were only 200 in the entire country. So there was a fair number of them who'd come to check me out and see exactly how crazy I was. And during the Q&A, one of them put up their hand and they said, Michael, you talked about the fact that we should ultimately put our trust in God. But my question to you is this: can God trust us? Now, isn't that a good question? I said to him, I've never been asked that question before. We are told that Jesus Christ did not trust himself to the hearts of men because he knew what was in their hearts and knew it couldn't be trusted. I said, however, I think ultimately God does want to be able to trust us, but before he can trust us, he must first transform us. He has to change our hearts to make us trustworthy. And this is what is right at the very center of the Christian gospel. the idea that actually, left to our own devices, we cannot live well. If we're prepared to be honest, all of us fail, and all of us make shortcomings, and the temptation is for all of us to continually cover it up or to blame someone else. But at the heart of the gospel is not just simply the idea of the Christian gospel that things should be exposed as they really are. But as things are exposed, there is a means by which they can be transformed, that we can become those people that he can trust and entrust with something very precious and very special. And that we, in that process, should become trustworthy, and it should be lived out and demonstrated in our lives. Not just simply a word of information, but a word of transformation. Christian faith is not a convenient moral framework that should make companies more profitable, although I think that's definitely the case, because if you are a Christian, you should not be stealing from your company, embezzling, or doing anything else. It is not just something that holds us up to a higher standard. The Christian faith is something that claims to be able to transform us, that we may joyfully and gladly live out that standard. Knowing that transformation at the center of your existence is at the heart of what it actually means to be a Christian. It's not about believing certain ideas, having certain experiences, or promising to do or not do certain things. It's about having that form of transformation. Now, I've talked for a very long time, and I want to be able to open up some questions, and we've covered a lot of ground, and I've taken some very large leaps along the way, which I'm sure you probably have noticed, unless you're snoozing right now because you're so busy you're catching up on sleep. In which case you can wake up now. It's almost time to leave. But the questions, therefore, I'd like to ask you remain, and it doesn't matter what your persuasion is about anything to do with God. The questions will still remain. Who do you trust? What's the standard that you employ? Are you trustworthy? What are the passions that get you out of bed every morning? What is the reason why you do what you do? Is it simply to make money? And, importantly, in light of question number 1, what are the things that channel and guide you so that those may be properly directed? And lastly, what is the framework that brings meaning to what you do? And more importantly, what is the word that can bring transformation into what you do, that you may be the person who you should be, and not just the person you currently find that you are? Well, I realize this may have been sort of a slightly deep subject for something that's done over lunch. And so if you have a question, then I'm very, very happy to answer it, and I'll do my best. There are 2 microphones here. If you're not sure whether you exist anymore, because you now feel so disorientated by the talk, then just play it back to an MP3 player, put my voice through an American filter, and maybe you'll understand what I'm saying. But is there a question here? Would you like to come and so everyone can hear, or yell it out?
My name is Nancy, and I work for a nonprofit called Motherhood.
Okay.
And one thing I've observed of a mother of 7 children is more than common. The question is that we are all microcosms of the world.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of if we're living ethically within our family and operating the way that we are, like in marriage or towards our children, as you study business, models and things like that, the more I live, I'm a baby boomer, the more I see that we are just like the world. Mm-hmm. What we do in our homes, even though those 4 walls can hide those things, whether we're ethical in our homes or unethical, it's no different than the banks or other businesses. And it's really been a very sobering thought for me.
Yeah, there's an American writer called Ramsden who wrote a book called The Corrections, another one called Freedom. I don't know if any of you have read them. They're very interesting. And that's a theme he picks up on his writing quite powerfully at times. But yeah, thanks for the comment. Anything else? Cool.
Hi, I'm Dina Gorell, and I work for AFLAC, which has won many industry awards for ethics year after year, so I'm very proud of that. But I'd rather stick needles in my eyes than cold call. Yeah. So in order to get in front of employers to tell them about our great benefits, how can I get excited about getting in front of people when I know that they don't trust me, they don't know me, they want to hang the phone up and get rid of me?
Yeah.
So how do you do that in sales? No matter what you're selling, everyone here is selling something different. But how can we get excited about that and convey our trust over the phone?
Okay, it's a very good point. And, I'm one of those people whose my phone number's on a list, which means actually people can't cold call me. So, and the reason is as you know, is what you've said, is that people think, I don't trust you. Now, I know there are more than two different types of consumer out there. I don't know if I'm not an expert on cold calling. What I can tell you is that if you did economics in the 1960s, you would have been told about someone called the rational consumer. Okay? And you would have done something called supply and demand curves. Did any of you do any of this at school? Okay? And where these two things intersect is how you figure out how much to produce and at what price you can sell it. Now, since the 1960s, there's been a huge slew of research done in economics, which basically proves the rational consumer is a myth. Okay? There is no such thing. For a rational consumer to be rational, they have to be aware of all of the options before them, all of their motives, the consequences of all of their decisions, okay, and be fully informed, okay, as to what that's going to finally look like. Now, there is no such person. Now, not only is there no such person, what we also know in terms of economic research is that consumers will consistently make self-defeating choices. Now, this is a puzzle. Even when we do know the consequences could be bad for us and probably are not true, why do we still go ahead and do it? Now, without going into that in huge detail, the reason why some kind of cold calling and cold marketing can work, because they know full well that they can make a promise that's not going to be actually met by whatever it is that they're selling, whatever product or service, simply not true. But there are enough people out there, okay, who will take them up on it that they can make money from it. It's a short-term strategy because it locks you into the extreme end of the irrational consumer. Because no one will believe what you have to say about anything else. So I understand the challenge. I'm not sure if I'm in the place to give best practical advice, but the question has to be, what is the strategy that we could employ that would actually genuinely win the trust of our consumers, of our customers over and potential ones? Now that's hard. Because it takes a longer-term strategy than many companies would feel comfortable with, given they report quarterly on their profits. Now, it's not to say that therefore it's impossible, but the advantage of living in a totalitarian dictatorship like China, if you're an economist, is you can put in place some very long-term goals. Now, they may be benign and they may be good for everybody, they may be bad and they may be bad for everybody, but it's actually easier to put with a long-term strategy. Now, I don't think, therefore, that means it is impossible to break out of that. What you need to do is you need to find someone in relationship to what you're doing to think, what would it mean that we could actually somehow go about winning the trust of those to us? And I realize that culture's changed a lot. I'm not sure how much better I am in terms of being able to give you that. I'm sure if I could come up with such a marketing strategy, I could make a lot of money. Do you want to...
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your comments. I don't know whether you've ever heard of Monty Roberts. Monty Roberts is a famous horse whisperer. He's the first man in recorded history, 6,000 years, to actually ride a wild horse without any violence. And he goes around the world and talks about trust. And the only way he can ride a wild horse, in 20 minutes without any violence is he gets the horses to trust him. And there's a language, a nonverbal communications pattern that he does that. So if you really want to see your theory in action, you actually can attend one of Monty's seminars or actually demonstrations. But he also has a book called Horse Sense for People. And it's in paperback now, and I recommend it to everybody. It's quite revealing. But I think you're right on.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. I think... one of the issues that we have, which we have not cracked in our culture, is the time it takes to build trust with people, individuals, is a relational quantity of time that most people feel they're unable to give. And so I'm going to read this book. But he needs those 20 minutes or whatever it is, one-on-one, to build it. And most of our companies are pushing us away from that. I mean, this may be slightly off-beam, but I'll just like to throw this out to you. And again, please forgive me if you feel that you're a Christian here today and I'm asking you too many difficult questions and I'm challenging you, but I can't help it. That's what I do for a living. There's psychiatric care you can go to. A couple of pills, you'll be fine. In a consumer-driven society, we cease to think of ourselves as people, as persons, and we start to think of ourselves as objects. Now, the relationship between objects and the relationship between persons is different. The relationship you have with an object is primarily one that is driven by consumption. Relationships between people are driven by connection. Now, our consumeristic society has become so extensive that even when it comes to an area like sex, for most people today, sex is driven by a consumption theory rather than a connection theory. So although I may have disagreed, let's say, with the hippie movement in the 60s in terms of their sexual proclivities, at least for most of them, a lot of the worldview that informed the lifestyle that they were living was, we're making some kind of mystical connection here. Whereas now, for most people, it's just about pure consumption. So people think of themselves as objects to be marketed, and there's other people as objects to be consumed. Now that then begins to inform our entire understanding of marketing, okay? Because it's non-relational. It's built on the basis purely of consumption. So the time is never taken. Now, where the challenge really comes is we should look at the church and realize that it looks radically different to the world in which it's in. That should be true. Sadly, for many, it's not. So many Christians will go to church to consume it. Okay? They want to consume the worship and everything else, the services that are provided, to make them feel better about themselves. And eventually, they even develop a consumer relationship with God. I feel bad about myself. If I can connect with God, I'll connect with him every so often to make me feel less guilty about how I feel right now. And they come and break off a little piece and they consume it to make themselves feel better. The trouble is that eventually that whole thing then becomes totally meaningless, which is why I think so many people struggle with the issue of meaning in work, because it's true at whatever level. It's like if you have a father-son relationship and the only time the son comes to the father is because he wants something from the father, he needs money, well, that may be fine the first few times. But if the only time the father hears from his children is when his children want something from him, eventually that relationship becomes meaningless. And even relationship with God becomes meaningless when the only time we ever spend any time with him is because we actually think that we need something from him when we're in trouble. So somehow we have to find a way both to challenge that culture within the church, and we also need to rediscover what that could maybe mean in the corporate world. But they're both good points. You have a last question? I know we're going to finish at 1 so that those of you who have to run can run. Some of you may want to run now. That's fine. You can pretend you've got something important. All you do is just take your phone, even if it's not ringing, hold it to your ear and just walk out like this and you'll be fine.
I'm curious to know where, just taking a step backwards, my husband and I were able, and actually a couple of our kids were able to go to Founders Week a few years ago, right before our U.S. elections, and I felt very discouraged.
This is 2008?
Yes, exactly, in Chicago. And yet at the end of that weekend, I was very, very encouraged to see that God was alive and working in all 4 corners of the world. And so now, thinking 3 years forward, when I think about, some of the profound atheists that Ravi has debated, where do you see, with a lot of things changing in the culture and the world, where do you see humanity at this point, like in terms of what people want? I think of my son and his next generation. I think they're yearning for authenticity. They don't want to see lots of shows and, just people pretending, but they really want to see what's real. And so as I think about in the last 3 years with the entire world and the economy, et cetera, just going by the wayside, and a lot of hypocrisy coming up within politicians and bankers and whatnot, any walk. I'd love to hear where RZIM, ministries and what you're all, what is the flavor now, has it changed, and what does it look like now?
It's very interesting you asked that. One of my colleagues, John Lennox, who's at our Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, which is a part of the ministry we're part of, RZIM, recently debated Peter Singer. And a few months before that, he debated Christopher Hitchens. And it was interesting. In the sense that at the end of Singer's debate with Peter Singer, he's one of your top ethicists who was in Australia, Singer came up and said to John Lennox, "I want to thank you for the way in which you debated with me." He said, "I've debated many people like you, evangelical Christians." He says, "but you treated me with such respect and gentleness, and you didn't go for the cheap shots." He says, "and I really appreciate it." He says, "as a matter of fact, I'm giving another lecture tomorrow. Would you consider coming along and listening to what I have to say, and then maybe we could have dinner together?" When he had his debate with Christopher Hitchens, exactly the same thing happened. One of our students who graduated from the OCCA, which is a centre we run in Oxford, we're connected with the university. We do a one-year program in evangelism and apologetics. We're just launching a master's degree, actually, through Oxford University, also in apologetics, next year. And maybe what may be of interest here is we run a 6-week program for businessmen and women, where you can come and sort of develop a worldview in relationship to the business world that you're in. When he graduated, he went back to Spain, and at the age of 22 ended up debating one of Spain's leading atheists, the Spanish equivalent, basically, of Richard Dawkins. And at the end of the debate, this guy came up to this young 23-year-old guy and said to him, "You're different from many other Christians I debated before. You actually seem to like people." Now, how about that as a distinctive to be singled out? Now, it is maybe sad that when we describe Christians as being uncompromising, that we should be uncompromised as Christians, the mental picture that comes into everyone's head is of a hard, unwielding, violent, person. The fruit of the Spirit is love, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-respect, control, goodness, and so on. You know it. So let's be uncompromising about that. Let us be thoroughly uncompromised when it comes to the fruit that should be manifested in our life in relationship with how we deal with other people, especially with those who disagree with us. Because many of the questions they have are actually perfectly legitimate. How do you know this is true? How can you say everybody else is wrong? Why, what happens to people who haven't heard this? Okay, what practical difference does this make? Why does the church look the way it does as opposed to some other way, and so on? There's nothing wrong with any of those questions. They're all perfectly legitimate questions, so let's not feel defensive or upset or precious if anyone comes and asks them. We should thank them for asking the question. We should acknowledge where we're actually currently failing, and then bring it back down and say, well, let me try to explain to you what this is ultimately all really about. And so I think for us as we go forward, one of the really big questions that we have is there are two sides to it. One, as we continue to grow, and the team is growing quite rapidly, and we're getting pulled into all different parts of the world, how do we continue to make sure that the character and the ethos that we require and we see as being fundamental to everything we do is preserved? And the second thing is, how can we meaningfully and legitimately engage with those who would disagree with us or maybe even wish at times to ignore us in a way where they feel that actually they have been treated as people rather than as arguments to be defeated, and understand that we understand that they are people, and we recognize and acknowledge that, and therefore will treat them as such. Otherwise, we're not even going to get, we're not even going to have a conversation. All there's going to be is an argument, and those two are not the same. Well, it's 1 o'clock. I promised I'd finish at 1 o'clock. So now here's your chance to be able to escape. One last question? Okay, go ahead. I'm happy to take more questions because I charge by the minute. So.
My name is Kimberly, and I'm with Christian Union, Christian Leadership Development Ministry. And as I think about your questions, have given me pause for thought. I think back about the first 25 years of my career of, I guess, doing it for the reasons that you were saying, the wrong reasons. But always thinking of myself as being trustworthy and never asking that question, could God trust me? Yeah. But always knowing at the same time that I couldn't trust everybody else. And now looking at these last 5 years, I have come to this realization, though, that even though I may have been doing everything or doing things for wrong reasons before, that God can use all these experiences and is using all of them for His glory in a certain way. And so I guess the question that I ask now is, what is the hope for transformation? for transformation of others who may have followed the same path of the go-go's of the 80s, those of us who kind of follow that consumption, conspicuous consumption, climb up the ladder, all that, now to a different understanding of what their life is about, that God has a plan for us, and he wants to use what it is that we have been through to positively impact his kingdom.
Yeah, okay. And so you are asking me just to comment on how we think he can use that? Okay, well, there are several reasons why the Christian faith can be very unpopular, and one of them has to do with the issue of repentance. Going around preaching a message that's fundamental about repentance has never been popular, because it assumes that the persons of whom we're talking about, including me, have done something wrong, and they therefore have something to repent about. Now, I don't know when the last time is that anyone came to you and said that they were sorry. In the corporate world, it can be quite far and few between. Now, sadly, in the church, it can be quite few and far between too. So, I think part of the answer is to say, well, look, this is what I bought into, this is what I thought. And what we need to do is basically get across to people that God is interested maybe in both ends and means. So it's not whatever means to get to that end. Both of those have to be dealt with. And where even the goal may have been right, but the manner in which we got there was wrong, then let's be big enough to actually talk about that. I know we organized in India a meeting which was attended by many CEOs in India of the leading companies, and one of the speakers there was a guy called James Riady, who is the CEO of the Lippo Group, which used to be primarily banking, is now one of the largest retail agents in all of Asia, and they've really diversified. He's actually one of the richest men in Asia. And he came and spoke to this room filled with 200 CEOs and basically told his life story, how as a Christian from his early 20s, of all the fundamental mistakes and errors he had made in terms of how he ran his business, the manner in which he acted, okay, and some of the corners that he cut that got him into huge trouble. Okay? And then talked about the struggles he was having now, both dealing with those, changing the way in which he was operating, and trying to make sure that the way in which he did operate was consistent with everything else he professed to believe. And it was a very moving and very heartfelt and very honest presentation. So we need to find a way in which we're actually prepared to be honest about where we haven't done well. I think the other thing to remember, though, is that if God were waiting for a group of perfect people to come along that he could use, he's going to be waiting for a very long time. Because there aren't any. So the next question then comes is, how do we begin to deal with that? Now, I think the culture is changing. Now, I know we live in a very litigious age, and so I realize we have to be careful about this, but I don't even know if I can name the company. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that or not. But let's just say that, I had a problem with something that happened. This company had, provided me a service, and things had gone really quite wrong. And then this person rang me up and just said, I'm just ringing to say, we are so sorry about this. It was our mistake and our error. We realize it's inconvenienced you and would like to apologize. I can remember thinking, I love this company. Who are they? Now, I was on the verge of actually taking my business elsewhere. And this one call, someone was actually prepared to say sorry, was all that it took for me to think, actually, I'm going to stay with you because, I appreciate that. And I do think the culture is changing. And I think even the corporate culture will be forced to rethink through some of its attitudes into some of the things, because I think the people coming through just simply are not interested in hearing endless justifications. And so, and I think at that point, it's be interesting, those who were part of that go-go generation are going to be the CFOs, the CEOs, and the senior management of all of these corporations. They either are now or they will be in the next couple of years. So it raises some very, very interesting questions. Anyway, look, I did promise that we would finish by about 10 past, and so, 1 o'clock, so